In the Living Law Nation series, each episode presupposes the legal existence of a particular nation or state. There is a presentation of some basic facts about the people, government, economy, and legal system of the country. But how exactly does a state come into being? Why do some cease to exist while others continue? And what does either situation mean for its inhabitants? These and other issues will be the focus of this Living Law Topical episode. In Part 2, we focus on an intriguing particular legal requirement of statehood, recognition by existing states. Finally, in Part 3, we will look at several attempts at creating a new state, some successful, some not, or at least not yet. The modern concept of the state as a political unit is the latest iteration of various forms of human groupings. The size and complexity of human groups has increased enormously since the earliest tribes and clans with their focus on kinship. Before there was an accepted and law-based definition of a state, borders were basically defined by those who had the most military power in the region. Might essentially made right. We explore this dynamic and its consequences in more detail in the Living Law Topical episodes, Law and Conflict, and Law and History. The early city-states of Greece paved the way for the rise of the Macedonian Empire. At its height, the Macedonian Empire stretched from the Balkans into Egypt, across the Middle East, and into India. It facilitated the spread of the Hellenistic civilization and laid the groundwork for the later Roman Empire. Roughly a millennium and a half later, empires were still in vogue. The most powerful one at this time came from the east. The leader of a nomadic clan would go on to found the largest empire the world had ever seen. In 1206, at a meeting of clan leaders, Temujin was recognized as the Khan, or leader, of the peoples collectively known as the Mongols. The Mongol army evoked terror wherever they went, as evidenced by this account from the papal envoy to the Great Khan.
The Mongols attacked Russia, where they made great havoc, destroying cities and fortresses and slaughtering men, and they laid siege to Kiev, the capital of Russia. After they had besieged the city for a long time, they took it and put the inhabitants to death. When we were journeying through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying about on the ground. Kiev had been a very large and thickly populated town, but now it has been reduced almost to nothing, for there are at the present time scarce 200 houses there, and the inhabitants are kept in complete slavery.
Historians present a mixed picture of Genghis Khan and his accomplishments. He became known for his ruthlessness in battle, though this was not unusual for the time. He introduced a form of meritocracy, a departure from the traditional Mongolian practice of treatment based upon status. He introduced the modern Mongolian script and a number of freedoms, in particular the freedom of religion. Religion was considered a matter of personal conscience. The legacy of empire building continued under Genghis Khan's sons and subsequent rulers. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean down to the Caspian Sea and into the heart of Europe. The Mongol Empire may not have left as deep an imprint in the law, language, or culture of its conquered territories, but Genghis Khan did leave behind something else: his genes. It is estimated that roughly 10% of the inhabitants of the former Mongol territories are descendants of Genghis Khan. The Iberian powers built their empires not by land, but by sea. Portugal's geography made it natural for its peoples to turn to the sea both for trade as well as for national security. To the east, it was boxed in by the various kingdoms of Spain, with which it periodically came into conflict. In 1385, during the reign of King João I, Portugal fended off Spanish forces at the Battle of Aljubarrota. It was around this time that Portugal's period of exploration and colonial expansion began, led by the efforts of Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry founded a school of navigation in Sagres, and during this period, the innovative Portuguese caravel was developed, which was ideally suited for the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean. There were many maritime firsts during this period, including the discovery of some Atlantic islands, the traversing of the equator, and the circumvention of the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa in order to reach India. Having accomplished these feats, the Portuguese explorers then continued on to Asia, successfully reaching Japan, Siam, and even China by sea. Macau became the first European settlement in Asia, thus ushering in a period of increasing European involvement in the region. The law which the Portuguese took with them on their missions of exploration was civil law with Roman law roots, along with the ecclesiastical law of the Church. The participants in the voyages of discovery and exploration believed they were on a civilizing mission, including the duty to spread Christianity across the globe. This mindset became part of the Portuguese national identity and informed Portuguese politics well into the 20th century. If Spain and Portugal launched the age of European exploration and colonization, it was Great Britain which took it to the next level. The 18th and 19th century versions of colonization resulted in some bizarre situations in terms of territorial boundaries. As the Europeans ventured further into the interior of the continent, they came across unspoiled lands which had all but disappeared back home. Our first task on this trip is to explore how in a mere century and a half, what came to be known as Nairobi went from this to this. The modern capital of Kenya and commercial hub for all of East Africa had very humble origins. The origin of the modern-day countries in East Africa began with the building of a railroad. So let's hop on board and take a ride back in time. The development of British East Africa was motivated by a desire to link and protect its coastal and interior interests. The railway venture began as an effort of a private company known as the British East Africa Company. But in addition to offering an opportunity for private gain, the project also held strategic significance for the British government. The Uganda Railway was created at the end of the 19th century to link the port of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya with what came to be known as Lake Victoria. Upon completion, the railway extended almost 1,000 miles into the interior and had a dramatic impact on the lives of the peoples in the region.
Imagine the boundary between Kenya and Uganda was in Naivasha before the railway was built, because by that time nations had not been formed. The East African nations had not been formed. They were just being ruled by the tribal chiefdoms were the autonomous and the most powerful people at that time. So Kenya enjoyed a unitary government for the first time when it was colonized in 1890.
For the British East Africa Company and later the British government, the main objective was creating a strategic link from the sea to a major source of the Nile River. British Administrator Sir Charles Eliot remarked,
"It is not uncommon for countries to build railways, but it is uncommon for railways to build a country."
As a result of independence, British East Africa broke down into individual countries. Yet despite the artificiality of many colonial borders, most African nations retained them post-independence. The various forms of empire show the central role played by physical territory. But is it possible to have a nation without having control over any territory at all? Once again, history provides us with an example to help us answer that question. In the Living Law Nations episode on Poland, we trace the rocky history of that country as a sovereign nation. The history of Poland raises the question as to whether a nation may exist even without control over a particular territory. On multiple occasions, neighboring powers occupied the territory which today comprises the Republic of Poland. In 1793, Prussia and Russia reached agreement on a further forced takeover of Commonwealth territory, which became known as the Second Partition. Poznan or Posen became the capital of southern Prussia, and the partition meant that Poles had direct control over only 1/3 of their people. There was some resistance, such as with the proclamation of Powaniek, under which the leaders promised to abolish serfdom in return for the support of the peasants. But this never enjoyed the full support of the nobility. Even the military leadership of Tadeusz Kościuszko, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, was not enough to prevent a third partition. In 1795, by treaty, the remaining territory of Poland was divided amongst Prussia, Russia, and Austria, leaving Poland with no territory of its own. As such, it was no longer a nation as generally defined by international law. That may have been the end of our story had the Polish nation not continued to exist in the hearts and minds of the Polish people. The Napoleonic period raised the hopes of the Poles that they could regain their country. One historian described the situation as follows.
After the Battle of Jena in 1806, Napoleon's armies appeared on Polish territory. His defeat of the country's 3 oppressors could not but be agreeable to the Poles, and his next step was a challenge. If the Poles could show him they were worthy of being a nation, he promised to give them a country.
There were small successes, such as the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw and an independent Republic of Krakow. As one historian put it,
Napoleon had transformed Poland. He had awakened a society traumatized by the partitions, allowed it to share in his glory, and set it dreaming.
But Napoleon's defeat in Moscow and the retreat of his armies left the aspirations of the Polish nationalists just that, a dream. For the remainder of the 19th century, ambitions of nationhood were mostly reflected in the arts. There were periodic violent insurrections, each one leaving the Polish people worse off than before. Nationalist leaders, as well as many artists, sought refuge in other European cities such as Paris. Poland was once again left at the mercy of its neighbors. It would take the jarring effect of the First World War to produce the re-emergence of an independent Poland. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the Polish Republic was recognized once again as a sovereign nation. Support from the Polish diaspora in the United States and the government of President Woodrow Wilson were key factors in the creation of this Second Polish Republic. The 20th century highlighted the fragility of nations in times of war, as both Germany and the Soviet Union occupied Polish territory. The post-war period was marked by the Cold War and a communist form of government. It was not until the 1990s, after a long and hard struggle, that a new version of the Polish nation emerged. Having seen several examples of how states come to be defined by their geography, and even an example of a country in suspended animation during periods of outside occupation, it's time to get back to our original questions. Just what is a state? And what are the legal requirements of statehood? Those questions have perplexed international jurists and politicians through periods of empires, colonies, and hot and cold wars. One international treaty gives us a common definition around which there is broad consensus. So let's test that definition on a somewhat unusual case. In addition to territory, religion can be a factor in the drawing lines of nations. As we explore in Living Law Vatican, the administrative organization of the Catholic Church has many of the elements of a state. So, now that we've covered that long and somewhat complex history, it's time to get back to our original question: just what is the Vatican under international law? At least since the 1929 Lateran Treaty, the Vatican seems to have a defined territory, albeit a small one. It receives plenty of visitors, both in bad weather and in good. It is especially populous around the Christian holidays. It even draws its fair share of protesters. But none of these are likely to meet the legal requirement of a permanent population. The Vatican has at least one permanent resident, in the form of the Pope. The Pope is supported by other members of the Church. The Vatican also has the remnants of its military forces, in the form of the Swiss Guard. As in the past, today's Swiss Guard attempts to defend the Pope from any attacks, and it also helps the occasional old lady looking for directions. Thus, the Vatican seems to meet this second requirement as well, even if its permanent population is relatively small. And if one includes the statues of the saints, that number gets even larger. And so we can safely turn to the third requirement, that of a functioning government. This the Vatican seems to meet easily, as it has its own political administration, its own postal services, its own bank, and even its own set of rules for visitors. And finally, the Vatican seems to meet the fourth and final requirement of capacity to enter into relations with other states. The Vatican has permanent diplomatic relations with over 100 states and has observer status at the United Nations. Thus, despite having many unique characteristics, the Vatican seems to meet all the legal requirements to be considered a state. The Vatican example shows that even a very small population can suffice to be a candidate for legal statehood. Granted, the Vatican aims to represent over 1.2 billion followers of Catholicism, but only a few hundred have official Vatican citizenship. Israel is another example of a nation where religion plays a defining role. The history of the Jewish people goes back thousands of years, and it, as well as Jewish law, is set out in the Tanakh. We explore this history in both the Living Law Nations episode on Israel, as well as the topical episode, Law and Religion. The modern state of Israel is the result of a combination of triumph and tragedy. The depth of the tragedy was the attempted genocide of all the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. This accelerated the momentum started earlier in the century by the Zionist movement, seeking a separate homeland for the Jewish people. That dream came to fruition in 1948 when the State of Israel was proclaimed and recognized by a series of other states. But the triumph of the Israelis came with costs for others in the region. Arab Palestinians have fought for their own country since then, making the area one of the most volatile on the planet. A 2018 law putting Judaism front and center of Israeli citizenship has increased the urgency for change felt by non-Jewish residents in Israel. A majority of the members of the United Nations support the idea of an independent Palestinian state. But continuing disputes about territory have complicated efforts to find a durable solution. So where do all these examples leave us in terms of our understanding of nations and states? Are states simply whatever enough people claiming to be part of one say they are? Does there need to be some form of consensus regarding the elements of statehood by both insiders and outsiders? That brings us to our next topic, the legal requirement of recognition of statehood.